What's your favourite one? Your favourite part of the job?
Probably cutting.
Cutting. But we don't do really any of that until Thursday.
Because that's probably the easiest job.
Oh, so you like easy work, do you?
Yeah. Oh, I was said too much. I'm sure he'd rather have me like this than be boring and quiet.
Well, we would, as long as you adhere to the rulings, what the workplace has.
I do, I don't.
Nobody's saying don't lose your sense of humour or come in and be miserable. We'd rather have you like you are, but as long as you did what you were supposed to do.
Yeah?
Yeah?
I'm doing.
I know you are here, yeah? Turn it, drop them all around, that's it. Turn it down, yeah. You enjoy that?
He asks me this every time. I don't know. Depends what mood I'm in.
If you're in a good mood.
If I'm in a good mood, I'll just get on with it. Along with one of the teachers.
Our vision is about moving young people into employability, and he wanted a job. His main goal is having a full-time job so that he can earn money to bring in for him and his dad.
My dad said I need to sort it out because I'm always getting into trouble, so I need to just get a job so I'm not getting into trouble.
Ryan has problems with controlling his anger. So we really worked on strategies, coping strategies he can use if something doesn't go quite his way.
I just used to just slam things down, have an argument with them, swear at them. So on the way off, I just flicked a kind of energy drink all over him.
So it won't let you on next time, will it?
It bounced off his head.
It's not going to let you on next time.
He bounced off his head and the drink went all over his uniform.
Probably not the best course of action.
He was walking out of college, you know, if things weren't going his way, he'd be walking out, he'd be swearing, telling us where to go, just going home. And then we'd talk it through with him, and he came back in, and we have got a good relationship with him now. So he has come on massively in himself.
We've learned him if he walks away, has a couple of seconds, composes himself again, come back, he normally ends up finishing the job. And all smiles again.
Yeah, I won this morning. I was too busy talking to my dad. Because big United fan, so it was like 5-0, yeah.
How did they play?
He was pissed out of his head. I said to him, right, I'm going, you get to bed. He's like, 5-0, I went, yeah, I know, 5-0, I'll go to bed. Flimsy these. A bit sketchy.
It won't be.
What kind of support do you offer to the warehouse?
So we visit, we phone up, we're always there. They have all our contact details, they have all Ryan's personal details if things were to go wrong when he's at the warehouse, but we're in contact weekly.
With Ryan, now this was a great thing, Ryan had missed a bus one morning. Now, some of these people we have worked in here for years would just come in. Ryan rang Lifebridge, told them he'd missed the bus, he was going to be late. They in turn got in contact with us, which I thought was great. You know, he used his initiative right from the word go there.
You have a
very close relationship, and that's really important for us with our employers, particularly because we want employers. You know, the last employee that Ryan had at Direct Tile and Stone, that hasn't worked, but the relationship hasn't broken down, and she is willing to have somebody else.
She sent me home because I didn't bring my jacket.
No. What do you do to that? Did you go home or?
Well, I spent an hour trying to convince her, saying I can still do it, I can do it next week. And she said, I need it, so in the end I just said, right then, you can shove your job up your ass. It was a massive deal. I brought everything else, my boots and that.
So what have you lost? with not having a job?
40 quid a week.
40 quid a week.
Which equals £65 when I come here.
Exactly.
That's some good money.
Yeah.
It is.
And what do we work for at the end of the week?
Money.
Money.
No matter if you think you're right, the employers will always be right. That's probably what I've learned. Because even though I think I'm right sometimes, they will not have any of it. They can just sack you on the spot and not be bothered.
It is hard getting our learners into employment anyway, because you've got people that interview for jobs, you've got people with qualifications coming out of university, colleges, apprenticeships. Our learners are at the bottom of that.
I didn't go in college on Monday because I was stressed. I was kicking off with my sister about something. And I went to my mum's to try and reflect on it. And Dee was like, "You've got so much potential, just get in college." And I refused to go in. And the next day, she was so upset.
So why do so many people actually think you've got so much potential? Is that probably because you have?
Probably, I don't know.
And there's one person who doesn't think so, and maybe yourself?
Yeah, 'cause I'm not really confident, to be honest.
Employees need to think a bit more creatively, because I think what employers do, they think, I have to give this person a full-time job. And what they were actually saying is, no, you need to think creatively. Are there aspects of a certain job that you could split off and take off and actually be undertaken by somebody with special educational needs?
That's it, really good. What a bloody rip it like last time.
Him getting a day job is being brilliant. If he got 2 days, I'd be ecstatic. If he got a full-time job, I'd be shouting from the rooftops, I think. But yeah, and it's great to see. You know, I love it. I love it.
I do. I think it's important that we have likes of Ryan in the workplace, and he brings the benefits. I'll say he's always smiling. He's a great sense of humour. All the people in here love him coming on a Friday morning. So yeah, he's a big part of us at the moment, and plays a big part as well.
And you find it? Do you enjoy your job?
I do enjoy it, yeah, but probably need more hours.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Is that something you're aiming for then? Getting more hours?
Yeah.
And why? What's your motivation for having a job?
Because you need to have money to pay for things.
Yeah.
Like bills and stuff. And then stuff for you. I mean, without money you don't live, so that's why you need a job.